Section 13 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11. The War of Pavia, 1515 to 1527, Part 1. On succeeding Louis XII in 1515, Francis I had instantly resolved on a career of military enterprise, feeling quite unable to endure the loss of Milan and the exclusion of French influence from Italy, which had followed the death of Gaston de Foix in 1512. An application from Venice for aid against the tyranny of the Spaniards, Maximilian, and the Pope served as a plea for a new Italian expedition. As the usual descent into Italy by the Mont Cenis and Suza was strongly guarded by the Swiss mercenaries of Spain, Francis, after collecting his army at Lyons, was persuaded to cross the Alps by the Valli Varita, leading from Barcelonnette to Saluzzo, the head of which is even now a trackless ridge covered with loose rocks. Forcing its way thus, in spite of great perils and losses, to the junction of the Varita with the Po, the French army appeared in Italy as if it had dropped from the skies, and the Swiss, who formed the greater part of the Spanish and Papal army, retreated in some confusion on Milan. Francis was prudently trying to bribe off their opposition, when his plan was frustrated by the arrival of 20,000 more Swiss from the St. Gothard under Scheiner, the Cardinal of Sion, a bitter enemy of the French. This leader immediately harangued his men, reminding them that ever since the fall of Charles the Bold in 1477 they had been the arbiters of Europe, that no sovereign could either move or stand without their help, and that if they did but stretch out their hands, there was money enough in France's military chest to enrich them all for life, and glory enough in defeating his forces to prove them the most redoubtable nation in the world. With these and other persuasions he induced them to make a hurried attack on the French, who were 10 miles from Milan at the village of Marignano. The battle began late in the evening, and before dark the Swiss had gained the superiority and even taken 15 French guns. But Francis employed the night in posting his forces afresh, and supported them so ably with his remaining artillery that on the next day the enemy with all their valour could not break his lines, and were themselves crushed by charges of the men-at-arms. At least 10,000 Swiss were slain, and what was more, their prestige of victory was broken. The survivors fell grimly back on Milan, and then retreated to their own country in consideration of a payment from Francis. The victory was decisive, for the Spanish and Papal commanders both asked for peace, leaving Milan to Francis as the prize of his few days' campaign. Every sovereign of Europe envied the young King of France the glory so quickly won. Henry, above all, could not hide his chagrin at the victory which had so far outdone his own prowess. His eyes were so red, says the French ambassador Bapaume, that it seemed as if the tears would come. His chagrin was the greater because both he and the Emperor had assumed that Francis would certainly come to grief in Italy. In vain did the nobles around him urge that he ought to be glad that Francis, his good brother and ally, had defeated the Swiss, who were so fierce and haughty that they presumed to call themselves the rulers and correctors of princes. Henry confessed that he ought to be glad, for that the Swiss were indeed mere villains, and he had ever known them as such. However, this did not hinder him from sending to Switzerland some clever agents charged to subsidize both Maximilian and the Swiss, and to excite them against France. Money never came amiss to the Emperor. Indeed, in this case he tried to possess himself of the Swiss subsidy as well as his own, and, after leading his army up to the gates of Milan, crowned all by accepting 200,000 crowns from the French, selling Verona to the Venetians, and withdrawing by the Valtellina to Trent in the Tyrol. As the bargain leaked out, it is no wonder that the English envoys Tunstall and Knight exhort Henry to close his purse for the future, and entertain Maximilian with words devised, thus treating the Emperor as the Emperor treated him. In the following February 1516 occurred the death of Ferdinand of Aragon. His grandson Charles was now king of all Spain, having been before this the possessor of the Netherlands, Flanders, Naples, Sicily, Artois, and Franche-Comté. Thus the chief states of Europe were in the hands of three young sovereigns, Charles being 16 years old, Francis 24, and Henry 25, and the rest of Henry's reign, so far as it was concerned with foreign politics, was chiefly occupied in hindering alternately Francis and Charles from becoming supreme in Europe. For the present he was in a manner friendly to both. He lent Charles the sum necessary for his voyage to Spain, and when he was thus out of the way, gradually made overtures to Francis, disarming suspicion by pretending to hate him beyond measure. One strong inducement to this was Francis's offer to pay 400,000 crowns for the restoration of Tournai. Hence Henry was willing in 1518 to go so far as to marry his 2 years old daughter, Mary, to the new-born Dauphin of France. Accordingly, the Admiral Bonnevet was sent over to represent the prince, and in that capacity placed a splendid wedding ring on Mary's tiny finger. Little appears to have been thought of the risk that England might thus become a province of France. Probably it was assumed that Henry and Catherine would still have sons. Thus Wolsey had succeeded for the time in placing England in a very unassailable position as regarded the two sovereigns. The time-honoured requirement of English trade was peace with Charles and the Netherlands. But the engagements with France were too elastic and too easily repudiated to be inconsistent with this main purpose. At the same time, we had gained the power of calling France to our help, and thus secured an object still higher, that of freedom from Spanish control. In any case, England might make her own terms for aiding either of the great rivals. And how valuable this power was appeared when, on Maximilian's death in 1519, Charles of Spain was elected Emperor against the competition of both Francis and Henry, and immediately began trying to enlist England on his side. For Wolsey's private ambition also, the quasi-friendship with both the great powers was very desirable, as new circumstances might put it in the power of either Charles or Francis singly to make him Pope if a vacancy occurred during a war, and both might agree to do this if no war was going on at the time. Meanwhile the Cardinal toiled on as usual in London. Business had always been his forte from the time when he had been first recommended to Henry by his speedy return from a mission to France, and by the boldness with which he had faced the responsibility of filling up a gap in his instructions. All matters of organization during the late wars had been carried out by him. Now he was at the height of his power, the whole direction of home and foreign affairs being absolutely in his hands. As Chancellor, he was constantly at Westminster Hall or the Star Chamber, judging causes in a manner which even his rivals could not help admiring. After this came a daily multitude of state affairs, whose pressure was so great that his friends entreated him, though in vain, to do no business after 6 in the evening for his health's sake. He kept a strong hand over the accounts of the country, so that even Henry's wastefulness was in a measure controlled, and therefore was of course unpopular with those who, like Lord Montjoy, had congratulated themselves at the beginning of the reign because avarice was now at an end and wealth flowed like water. To these tasks were added his duties as cardinal and as papal legate a latere. Both these dignities had been conferred upon him by Henry's expressed desire, the former as the price of the king's joining the league against Francis in 1515, the latter as the only condition on which Campeggio would be received in 1517. As legate, his rule over the Church in England had a terrible completeness, for his jurisdiction extended over all bishops, superseded all privileges, and was final for all appeals. His enemies declared that he gained his influence over Henry by witchcraft, so completely did he eclipse Warham, Fox, Norfolk, Suffolk, and the other members of the council. His taste for splendour was intuitive. It seemed rather a part of his general greatness than a sign of vanity that he should like to see the tapestries of his antechambers changed every week, to have round him curious clocks or pictures by Quintin Massys, to be followed by many attendants mounted on beautiful and well-trained horses. His choir was held to surpass the king's, although Sagadino says that the voices in the chapel royal were more divine than human. Indeed, in all such things he seemed to aim at absolute perfection. Of course, this demanded vast wealth, and so he was not precisely scrupulous how he obtained it. But he was still more eager to obtain money for the king. Curious proofs of this are his standing out for an unusual proportion of the proceeds of indulgences in England in 1517, and his declaration in 1525 that he considered it a minister's duty to enrich his master at the expense of the people, as Joseph did Pharaoh. Hastening back from Spain for the purpose in the spring of 1520, the young emperor visited England, thus performing in the eyes of all genuine lovers of etiquette an act of extraordinary condescension to Henry, who by papal ordinance ranked only 9th among sovereigns. But Charles was anxious to forestall the effect of the personal interview between Henry and Francis, which had been already planned for the ensuing summer. Accordingly he landed at Dover on May 25th, was visited by Henry there, and like a dutiful nephew returned with him to Canterbury to visit Catherine, who was on her part wild with delight at seeing the head of her family and hearing her native language spoken. The two monarchs held much secret conference, the purport of which was unknown. But the presence of the emperor with his small and plainly dressed suite was clearly exercising a powerful influence, and we shall soon see that the heartless splendours of the Field of the Cloth of Gold were quite unable to counterbalance it. When the emperor was gone, Henry sailed for Calais, May 31st. Wolsey having obtained a promise that no French war vessel should leave any Channel port as long as the interview lasted. The forlorn town of Guisnes was appointed for the meeting, but the English architects had during the preceding weeks raised on the castle green there a splendid summer palace, 328 feet square, pierced after the fashion of the day with many oriel windows. Its entrance was adorned with olive-crowned statues of antique appearance, and the secret passage led from it to the castle. Francis, on his part, had imitated in a distant kind of way the English magnificence, having in vain asked that costly tents should be forbidden on either side. He had also proclaimed, in order to limit his suite, that none of his subjects should come unbidden within 2 leagues of the royal procession. When the signal for starting was fired from Guisnes and answered from the French headquarters at Ardres, there was a moment's anxiety. Lord Abergavenny declared that Francis had brought with him twice the stipulated number of soldiers. Henry, however, readily believed that his men were frightening the French quite as much, and did not hesitate to advance. The sovereigns embraced, first on horseback, then on foot, while the English made the best use possible of their few words of French, the main part of which seems to have been bon ami. At the next meeting Henry laughed outright at hearing a herald describe him as King of France, and jovially declared this to be a very great lie indeed. On June 11th the jousts began, and were continued for a week. During them 2 notable events occurred: the death of a French knight by a too royal thrust of Henry's lance, and Francis's chivalrous act in coming to the English palace at breakfast time with only 4 attendants, and thus deriding the precautions which had hitherto guarded their interviews. Such was in outward seeming the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Of the inward heart-burnings which attended it no record has been kept, but we can easily imagine the feelings of those who, like the Duke of Buckingham and Lord Abergavenny, hated the whole thing as Wolsey's work, and would have been thankful if some quarrel had sprung from it to shake his power. There was no need for anxiety as to its effect in strengthening the French alliance, for it was hardly over when Henry betook himself straight to the Emperor at Gravelines to renew the Canterbury Conference, not vouchsafing to Francis the slightest hint of what the two were planning together. His next step was to send an ominous remonstrance against the French repairs of the Ardres fortifications. Was his good brother intending to disquiet the English subjects of the Pale? Of course, Francis's right was clear on his own side of the boundary. Still, he thought it better to yield, in the hope of at least delaying Henry's enmity. Meanwhile, Charles's motives for conciliating Henry became stronger every day. The cities of Spain were engaging in the struggle for liberty mentioned in Chapter I, and neither from thence nor from the Netherlands could he get any supplies of money. He had pledged himself to hold a diet at Worms in the course of the year and settle there not only the Luther affair, but all the outstanding feuds and disputes of Germany, and it was most desirable for him to be in Italy and hinder the consolidation of French influence there. To accomplish even a part of these objects, the alliance of England was indispensable, and negotiations to strengthen it were therefore going on apace, when the attention, not of England only, but of the foreign powers, was distracted by the striking episode of the trial and execution of the Duke of Buckingham in May 1521. As this nobleman was descended from Thomas of Woodstock, the sixth son of Edward III., his royal blood made him constantly fret against Wolsey's domination. His anger, too, was dangerous from his powerful connections, for he had married the daughter of the Earl of Northumberland, Lord Surrey was his son-in-law, and Ursula, the daughter of Lady Salisbury, his daughter-in-law. He had offended the king as early as 1509 by inducing Sir W. Bulmer to leave the royal service for his own, and had also excited suspicions at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Charges were now brought against him by a steward named Knevet, whom he had dismissed, detaining, it is said, his property unjustly, and by Sir Gilbert Park, his chancellor, and others. By way of precaution, Northumberland was arrested and Surrey sent to Ireland. Then the Duke himself was summoned from Thornbury to London, and found that all along the road he was watched by armed men at a distance. On arriving in London he tried in vain to see Wolsey, and was presently lodged in the Tower. On May 13th he was arraigned before the Lord High Steward's court, and the depositions were read and asserted by the witnesses to be true. If so, they certainly amounted to treason according to the ideas of the time, for the Duke had listened to prophecies that he should soon be king, and rewarded them with valuable presents. This appeared to throw a new light on an attempt of his to get the king's sanction to a levy of troops, which he thought of making on the Welsh border. Perhaps also on some presents which he had made to the king's guardsmen. He was also sworn to have said that the death of the king's children was a judgment for the murder of Lord Warwick, and that if questioned on the Bulmer affair, he would not hesitate to plunge his dagger into Henry's breast. Of course, none of the trials of the time can inspire any real confidence, for the accused had no counsel, and could not cross-examine or bring counter-evidence. And wherever the means of discovering truth was thus neglected, it is impossible to believe that substantial justice was generally or even frequently done. The Duke laboured under the farther difficulty that Henry had let it be known before the trial that he had gone through the evidence and considered him guilty. It is said that Buckingham admitted some of the charges while in the Tower. At any rate, when condemned, he refused to ask for mercy, and on May 17th died as his father had died in 1483. Some of his estates were afterwards given back to his son, Lord Henry Stafford, who was also allowed by Edward VI to succeed to the barony of Stafford, from which his father had taken one of his titles. While the trial was proceeding, Francis had been pressing on the war in Italy, hoping to secure himself there while Charles was still embarrassed by the revolt of the Spanish cities. The Emperor therefore called for English help according to what was now acknowledged to have been the last year's agreement, namely, that England should help whichever of the two contending parties was first attacked by the other. On the plea that it was necessary to ascertain which was the aggressor, Wolsey was sent by way of Calais to the Netherlands, and his quasi-mediation was made to occupy not less than 4 months, during which we were preparing for war, and Francis losing instead of gaining ground in Italy. On his return Henry gave him the rich Abbey of St. Albans in reward for his skilful tactics, and it seemed that these would also win him a far higher prize, inasmuch as the news of Pope Leo's death arrived toward the close of the year, and so recent a service to the Emperor was a strong claim on his support. But in spite of all his promises, Charles did very little in his favour, and the choice fell on Adrian of Utrecht, Charles's tutor, who is now enthroned as Adrian VI. It may be mentioned here that in the next papal election, 1523, Charles did write strongly in Wolsey's favour, but at the same time sent orders that the courier should be detained till the new pope was chosen. End of Section 13.